Staff Sergeant Adriana Voss had heard the words on her first morning of basic training. The drill instructor had leaned close enough for her to feel the spit hit her cheek as he barked, "You worthless little girl. You will never make it past basic training." The insult clung to her in a way that sweat and sand never could. She was 23, fresh from the final semesters of her engineering degree, already worn down by family turmoil and the weight of loans she had no hope of paying. The Army had offered her a clear path, steady pay, and the discipline she thought she lacked. What it gave her instead was fire. Her parents' divorce during college had left her with no home to return to. She had worked late shifts at a machine shop, her hands learning the feel of precise torque and calibrated measurement. Numbers and steel behaved with a consistency that people did not. When she signed her enlistment papers, she thought the Army might respect that. Instead, she found herself mocked for her quiet demeanor and deliberate pace. The stronger recruits flexed in the mirror of others' attention, while Adriana learned how to absorb every blow of doubt without flinching. By the time she reached Forward Operating Base, Phoenix 3 years later, she had earned the title of Staff Sergeant in ammunition logistics. It was a job most soldiers looked past, a duty that demanded counting, tracking, and hauling rather than glory. She wore the dust of the Afghan desert on her boots and uniform each day as she crouched over the firing range, collecting the scattered brass casings left behind by Special Forces marksmen. The casings rattled in her gloved hands, dismissed fragments of training that others no longer needed. For her, they became a symbol. Each piece of metal carried the echo of a shot fired, the trace of energy released, and the reminder that discipline left its mark even after the sound had faded. The firing range itself seemed endless. Targets were hammered into the desert floor at distances so far that the human eye could barely find them. Heat shimmer bent the horizon, tricking even the most practiced shooters. Adriana moved through this world like a shadow, unseen yet constant, keeping the range running. She counted each round expended, logged ammunition lots, and made sure nothing interfered with the next day's practice. The elite snipers barely glanced at her as they polished their rifles and boasted about distances. She was background, necessary but forgettable. What none of them realized was that she watched each correction they made for wind, each whispered adjustment for temperature, each hesitation before a shot. She took in silently. Her engineering mind turned it over, as though solving equations in steel and sand. She saw how the flags along the range shifted with invisible currents. She noted how the air thickened. When the temperature climbed past 100.0 degrees, she understood that consistency in hand pressure or the angle of the shoulder mount could mean inches on a target nearly 2 miles away. The desert gave her isolation, but it also gave her clarity. In the shimmer of heat and the silence after the report of a rifle, she found her rhythm. Humiliation from years past no longer stung. It hardened into quiet fuel. The insult of being invisible became the ground where determination rooted itself. Every shell casing she picked up was not just trash for disposal. It was evidence that precision mattered. It was proof that even in work, ignored by others, there lived a chance to master what they took for granted. Adriana Voss was not yet known to anyone at Base Phoenix. To them, she was simply the logistics sergeant with steady hands and little presence. But beneath the quiet surface, the seeds had already been planted. The unnoticed and the dismissed often carried the deepest reservoirs of potential, and hers was about to be tested in ways no one there could imagine. For 8 months, Staff Sergeant Adriana Voss lived in the rhythm of the range. Each morning she walked out into the Afghan desert before the heat could fully settle. Though the sun rose fast and burned the horizon, white, the targets stretched endlessly into the sand, their outlines shimmering until they seemed more illusion than steel. Flags along the firing lanes shifted with the lightest breeze, and she had learned to read them as though they were words written across the air. Where others saw fabric rippling in the wind, she saw numbers, minutes of angle, inches of drift, seconds of flight. Her days followed repetition. She crouched in the dust, gloved hands sweeping brass into buckets, the sound of clinking casings following her like a second heartbeat. Around here, the snipers laughed, cursed, and called out their shots. They boasted about kill records or complained about heat mirage, and she remained silent. No one asked what she thought. No one asked what she noticed. And so, unseen, she absorbed it all. Adriana tracked the rhythm of their corrections. A shooter flinched when the wind picked up. She saw the miss land wide. Another tightened grip on the stock in frustration, pulling the barrel just enough to ruin the grouping. Every mistake became a lesson. Every adjustment, a calculation. She carried these fragments home each night, turning them over in her head as if solving a mechanical puzzle. Her training as an engineer made patterns clearer. Temperature, barrel wear, humidity variables others grumbled about. She mapped into order. When the snipers reset between drills, she stayed moving quietly, retrieving spent rounds, checking targets, and noting where groups clustered. They ignored her presence, and that invisibility gave her freedom. She studied their scopes when they left rifles unattended, memorizing elevation dials and reticle markings. She compared their chosen adjustments to where bullets had actually landed, noting the difference in her mind. To anyone else, she was just the shell collector. To herself, she was cataloging a private education in long-range marksmanship. The desert itself seemed determined to teach her patience. By midday, the air shimmered so heavily that even a clear shot bent and warped in sight. Dust coated her uniform, soaking with sweat until fabric clung to her skin. She learned how stillness mattered, how holding posture against discomfort was part of accuracy. The sand baked under her knees, but she did not complain. Every discomfort endured was one more lesson in control. She never kept notebooks where others could see. Instead, she carried the figures in her head, replaying numbers in quiet mantra. Distance, wind, drop, correction. Her mind became a silent logbook. Pages filled with equations no one knew she was writing. At night, when the base quieted and the mess hall emptied, she sketched wind charts on scraps of paper by dim light, then tore them up before anyone else could notice. It was her own hidden archive of knowledge. Fragile but essentiel. The others never looked twice at her. Their laughter rolled past as they cleaned weapons or shared stories of deployment. Adriana sat at the edge, hands steady, face indriadable, content to be overlooked. Yet beneath that silence, a certainty grew. Mastery did not announce itself with medals or speeches. It took shape in shadows, in repetition, in labor unacknowledged by anyone else. She knew she was learning more than how to keep the range supplied. She was learning how to see what others ignored. And one day, she understood that unseen work might be tested. She would not seek the spotlight. But if it came, she would not look away. The desert morning was already hot enough to blur the horizon. Staff Sergeant Adriana Voss moved along the range with her usual quiet rhythm, bent to gather scattered brass, while the Special Forces, snipers, packed up their equipment. The Barrett rifles gleamed on their mats, heavy with reputation, their long barrels catching the hard light. She kept her focus on the casings rattling in her gloved hands, content to be invisible. It was then that Master Sergeant Kane's voice rolled across the sand, loud enough to reach her even at a distance. "She's been out here every day for months," he said, his tone pitched for amusement. "Probably thinks she could do what we do." His teammates chuckled, quick to join his performance. Adriana did not look up. She had heard the jokes before. Kane was 6 feet of decorated muscle, a man who carried the weight of multiple deployments and marksmanship trophies. He was everything the Army celebrated, and he knew it. Kane turned back to his team with a grin. "I bet she's never fired past 300 yards. Hell, maybe not even that far. Supply Girl probably thinks collecting brass makes her a sniper." The laughter grew louder, sharper in the thin air. Adriana kept sweeping casings into her bag, her movement steady, though the heat building inside her chest rose faster than the desert sun. He was not finished. "I'll put a month's pay on this," Kind said, lifting his voice until the men leaned closer. No way she could even hit at 1,000. Not a chance. Certainly not at 1,500. What we do isn't for logistics clerks. His words landed like blows disguised as jokes. Casual dismissal, carrying the full weight of authority. Adriana stopped moving. The brass she had collected pressed cold through her gloves. She felt her heart hammering hard enough to shake her ribs, but her hands were steady. Slowly she rose, eyes lifting from the ground to meet his. For a moment, all sound on the range seemed to thin, laughter tapering into uneasy quiet. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the heat. "What if I could make a shot at 2,985 yards? The words hung in the air longer than the echo of any rifle. The men around Kane froze, their amusement evaporating. The desert itself seemed to pause. 2,985 yards was not just a number. It was legend. It was the distance of the longest confirmed kill in modern military history. Achieved by a Canadian sniper under near-perfect conditions, it was a record whispered with awe. A shot so precise and improbable, it felt closer to myth than fact. And now the logistics sergeant, the shell collector, had spoken it aloud. For a long beat, no one moved. Adriana's chest tightened, fear rising with the silence. She had surprised even herself. The challenge had not come from planning, but from somewhere buried deep, from years of dismissal and the quiet certainty that had grown in the shadows of this range. Her cheeks burned, but her voice did not waver. Kane blinked at her, then let out a laugh that was louder than before, though less certain. 2,985, he repeated, dragging the words as if to test them. "That's the longest shot on record. You think you can match that?" His eyes gleamed with disbelief. Yet beneath the ridicule was a flicker of something else: surprise. Maybe even the smallest edge of doubt. Around him, soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some smirked, expecting her to crumble. Others waited, curious in spite of themselves. Adriana said nothing further. The brass casing still filled her hands, forgotten, but symbolic now, dismissed, debris held as proof of her resolve. Kane leaned closer, grin returning, though thinner this time. "All right, supply girl, you want to embarrass yourself in front of everyone. Let's make it official. Saturday morning, you get one shot at my target. With my Barrett, if you miss, you clean weapons for a month. If by some miracle you hit, well, then you can have my respect." The men laughed again. Though more hesitantly than before, Adriana did not smile. She gave a single nod, then bent back to her work. The sand shimmered around her, the horizon stretching endlessly. And in the silence left behind, she felt the strange relief of having finally spoken. Courage, she realized, does not wait for permission. It emerges when dismissal forces the unseen to declare their worth. The bet spread through Forward Operating Base Phoenix faster than a dust storm. By the time evening mess was served, the story was already told with exaggeration. The shell girl had challenged Master Sergeant Kane. She had claimed she could hit a target at 2,985 yards, farther than most men on the base had even dreamed of attempting. In the mess hall, soldiers leaned across tables, exchanging wide grins and shaking their heads. It was impossible, they said. The longest recorded shot in history, and she thought she could match it. Plates clattered. Voix rose, and the nickname Supply Girl circled the room like a ghost. Everyone wanted to claim. Betting slips appeared before night fell. Some wrote their wagers on napkins. Others scrawled names on the back of ration envelopes. The odds were almost entirely against her. Kane, seasoned and decorated, was expected to win by default. Adriana Voss was the unseen presence who counted shells and cleaned equipment. No one believed the quiet woman had the audacity to try, much less succeed. Command took notice. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez heard the rumors by morning and considered shutting the whole affair down. Allowing a logistics sergeant to handle a Barrett M82 at maximum distance seemed reckless. The weapon cost more than most cars, and the ammunition alone was limited. Yet Kane had framed it as a training exercise, and Adriana had technically volunteered for additional duty. After heated discussion in the commander's office, the decision was made: it would be allowed, the regulations bent just enough to make room for spectacle. Kane radiated smug confidence in the days that followed. He brushed off questions with a smirk, reminding anyone who asked that he would enjoy watching her fail. To him, it was entertainment, a chance to reinforce the hierarchy of skill and reputation. His teammates shared in the laughter, already imagining the humiliation Adriana would face when she missed wide of the target. Adriana felt the weight of all of it pressing down. She returned to her bunk after long days on the range and sat awake under the narrow beam of a flashlight. Bent over charts she had hidden away, ballistics tables, wind drift calculations, and temperature adjustments filled her nights. She traced formulas on scraps of paper, whispering the numbers under her breath until they became rhythm. She imagined the trajectory, the bullet's arc against gravity and air resistance. The long seconds of flight. Sleep eluded her. In the stillness of the barracks, she listened to the faint hum of generators outside, her breath steady as she recalculated the impossible shot again and again. Her hands were steady, though her chest ached with the pressure of expectation. Fear gnawed at the edges of her resolve, whispering of public failure, of confirming every insult ever spoken. Yet with each doubt came the memory of the insult at basic training, the drill instructor's voice calling her worthless. It came too with the memory of Kane's dismissive laughter. These echoes hardened into something stronger than fear. Around here, the atmosphere of the base grew thick with anticipation. Soldiers whispered as she passed, some smirking, some shaking their heads. She became the subject of a story told in half-joking tones, the ghost of a legend not yet written. The desert itself seemed to lean in, the air hotter, the days longer, the silence before dawn heavier with expectation. The storm before the shot was building, and she was caught in its center. Yet within that pressure, something sharpened. The calculations repeated in her mind gave way to certainty. Each number and correction, a brick in the wall she built around her doubt. Pressure could crush the unprepared. But Adriana Voss was not unprepared. Quiet discipline was her language. And in silence, under scrutiny, she found not collapse, but clarity. Saturday morning arrived with an uncanny stillness. The Afghan desert stretched wide and bright, under a sky that seemed polished of every cloud. The flags along the range hung motionless, not a hint of wind stirring their edges. For once, the air carried no tricks of mirage or distortion. It was as though the desert itself had decided to bear witness. Soldiers gathered early, forming loose clusters along the range. They spoke in low murmurs, voices carrying the nervous energy of an event everyone wanted to see. Some clutched folded betting slips in their fists. Others leaned forward with arms crossed, eager for spectacle. The logistics sergeant who counted shells had stepped into a story that belonged, by reputation, only to legends. Their faces carried skepticism, amusement, and the faint edge of disbelief that made crowds lean closer. Master Sergeant Kane stood a few paces back, arms folded across his chest. He wore his smirk as naturally as his rank, the picture of confidence before what he assumed would be her humiliation. His teammates chuckled among themselves, relaxed in the certainty of what they believed was coming. Adriana Voss walked past them without shifting her gaze, her boots pressed into the sand with deliberate rhythm. Inside her chest, the storm gathered, each heartbeat a hammer of nerves. But her outward frame was calm. She approached the firing line where the Barrett M82 waited, its long barrel gleaming faintly in the morning light. The weapon was heavier than any rifle she had handled, a piece of machinery meant for power at range. She had studied its every angle from afar, watched its recoil, measured its cadence. Now it was hers for a single attempt. She lowered herself to one knee, then eased flat behind the rifle. The bipod dug into the sand with a crunch. Her gloves moved carefully, adjusting the height, settling the weapon as though it were part of the earth itself. The scope glinted, already dialed to Kane's settings. Match-grade ammunition lay in a neat row at her side, each round like a promise. The crowd hushed as she settled in, the sound of movement falling away, until only the desert pressed close. Adriana's breath slowed. She remembered her father's voice from years ago, telling her she was too quiet, too careful, not bold enough to leave a mark. She remembered nights bent over charts, the glow of a flashlight across numbers, the rhythm of equations whispered like prayer. Every moment led here. To this line in the sand, she adjusted her cheek against the stock, the metal warm beneath her skin. Her left hand tightened gently on the foregrip, her right hovering near the trigger guard. She felt the weight of the rifle settle into her body, anchoring her. The scope carried her eye down the impossible distance, across air and heat, toward a target nearly invisible to the naked eye. Behind her, Kane's smirk flickered. Though his voice remained steady, "Let's see it then. Supply girl." Adriana inhaled once, slow and deliberate. She exhaled, the air leaving her lungs like pressure released from steel. The ritual of readiness held her in place. The desert gave no sound, no distraction. In that silence, she found the edge of calm that discipline builds. She was not just preparing to pull a trigger. She was stepping into everything she had trained herself to hold. Every unnoticed calculation now distilled into posture and breath. Mastery, she knew, was not revealed in the shot itself, but in the ritual that led to it. Staff Sergeant Adriana Voss lay prone in the sand, her body aligned with the length of the Barrett M82, as though she were part of the weapon itself. The rifle was steady against her shoulder, its bipod rooted deep in the grit. The desert was unnaturally still, the morning light spilling clear across the range. Every sound, the shuffle of boots, the murmurs of soldiers behind her, fell away, until all that remained was the slow cadence of her own breathing. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs until her ribs pressed against the stock. She held, then exhaled with deliberate control, the barrel settling fraction by fraction closer to stillness. Through the scope, the target shimmered, a tiny speck nearly invisible against the horizon. She noted the flags unmoving, temperature stable, mirage low. She had calculated this shot 100 times in sleepless nights. Each correction whispered, until the numbers became part of her pulse. Bullet drop, wind drift, humidity, barrel harmonics. Each variable locked into place. Her finger found the trigger guard, the pad of her index finger resting with feather weight. She remembered her father's words, that she was too careful, too quiet. She remembered Kane's mocking voice, the laughter of the men who thought she was nothing more than a shell collector. The echoes of dismissal tightened into resolve. She drew in another breath, steady and deep. Her pulse slowed, a rhythm she had trained into her body. The crosshairs drifted with the rise and fall of her chest, then settled into perfect alignment as she paused at the bottom of her exhale. In that fraction of stillness, she began to press, not a pull, not a jerk pressure, slow and even, the kind that broke sear metal without movement. The shot broke like thunder. The Barrett kicked hard into her shoulder, a violent recoil that rattled her bones. The muzzle blast tore the desert silence wide open, echoing across the barren flats. The weapon leapt back, but she held it firm, cheek still pressed to stock, scope still aligned. Then came the longest silence of her life. The bullet carved its arc unseen, slicing through nearly 2 miles of hot desert air. The soldiers behind her leaned forward instinctively, eyes straining toward the horizon, though nothing could be seen at that distance. Adriana did not move. Her body was still locked into position, waiting. every nerve alive with suspended tension. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The fourth stretched into eternity. The radio crackled. The range officer's voice came calm. Professional. Undeniable. Target hit. Center mass. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the shot itself. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The desert held its breath again, as if acknowledging what had just happened. Then the murmurs began. Low at first, disbelieving. Soldiers blinked at one another, mouths open, betting slips crushed in their hands. The impossible had been made real in front of them. Adriana slowly lifted her head from the scope. She let out a breath she had been holding since the trigger broke. Her face was calm, her hands steady, though her chest hammered with adrenaline. She did not smile. Triumph needed no grin. The proof was already written across the desert steel nearly 3,000 yards away. Kaina's expression collapsed in stages. The smirk dissolved first, replaced by disbelief, then by something rawer. He stepped forward, boots crunching in sand. His voice lower now. He extended his hand. Words reluctant but honest. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Adriana looked at him for a moment, then shook his hand once. Firm and simple. Behind them, the range was alive with chaos soldiers rushing to confirm the distance. Voices rising in astonishment. Every detail of the conditions being documented. Yet at the center of it all, she remained composed. The quiet logistics sergeant who had turned dismissal into proof. The Barrett still lay heavy against the earth, its barrel cooling, its recoil lingering in her bones. The echo of the shot rolled in her memory, but louder still was the silence that followed. For in that silence, she had written her own name into history, not through noise or boast, but through precision. The quietest voice on the range had just spoken in the loudest way possible. The desert erupted into motion the moment the range officer confirmed the shot. Soldiers scrambled toward the horizon, their boots throwing up dust as they hurried to verify the impossible. Measuring tapes stretched across the sand, flags planted into the earth to mark each recorded distance. Officers knelt beside the target, double-checking, then checking again. As though disbelief demanded ritual, radios crackled with hurried voices, reporting the result, each transmission carrying both astonishment and urgency. Adriana Voss stood quietly apart from the chaos. She rose from her prone position, brushing sand from her gloves, her breathing slow and measured. The Barrett M82 lay cooling behind her, its barrel radiating faint heat into the morning air. Around her, men and women who had dismissed her as invisible now whispered her name with the awe usually reserved for myth. She did not move toward them. She simply gathered herself. Calm against the storm, Master Sergeant Kane pushed through the crowd, his stride less certain than usual. He stopped in front of her, his smirk gone, replaced by something heavier. He extended his hand. For the first time since she had arrived at FOB Phoenix, his voice carried no mockery. I was wrong. Dead wrong. He said simply. His words were quiet, but the men around them heard. Adriana clasped his hand once. Firm, but without flourish. She did not gloat. She did not need to. By evening, the news had spread beyond the wire of the base. Reporters called, asking to confirm the story of a female sergeant who had matched the longest shot in military history. Officers answered cautiously, their voices clipped, reminding callers of classification and protocol. The Army's public line was restrained. It was not policy to elevate a logistics specialist to sniper legend. No matter the evidence, what mattered to command was that the base functioned smoothly, not that a single soldier had made history under unorthodox circumstances. Adriana returned to her barracks in the same silence she had carried all along. The soldiers in the mess hall glanced up as she passed, some nodding respectfully, others simply staring. The betting slips had been discarded or hidden. Shame folded into silence. She offered no comment, no explanation. She had nothing to prove beyond the shot itself. Outside, on the range, the target plate bore its mark. Center mass. A clean strike where none had been expected. Officers photographed it, filed reports, and logged the conditions. In the records, it would be written as an event, a data point. But for those who had stood on the sand that morning, it was something larger. A shift they could not quite name. Reporters continued to press, but Adriana kept to her duties. The next morning, she was back at the range, bent over in the dust, collecting brass casings. Her hands moved with the same steady rhythm as always. To some, it seemed absurd that the woman who had silenced the entire base with a single trigger pull was again stooped in the dirt, unseen. But she carried no bitterness. The quiet pride in her chest was enough. Kane passed her once more that week, his expression less certain, his voice low. He did not mock her again. Respect had replaced scorn. Even if it came with no official recognition, Adriana accepted that truth without regret. Achievement without elevation defined her place. Glory was never hers to claim. But worth had been proven beyond denial. True recognition did not live in medals or headlines, but in the weight of precision that could never be taken back. Weeks passed, and the desert returned to its familiar rhythm. The long days of training exercises, the thud of boots on sand, and the endless tally of ammunition blurred together once more. Yet within the routine, something had shifted. In the mess hall, junior soldiers leaned over trays, lowering their voices, as though speaking of a ghost. They whispered of the shell collector who had made the impossible shot. Some told it with a grin, claiming they had stood close enough to see her hands never shake. Others spoke with awe, their words carrying the weight of witnessing a truth that official reports refused to recognize. The army filed it away as a training event, a line in a log without emphasis. There were no medals, no briefings, no banners raised in honor. Officially, it was little more than a drill. But in the quiet corners of the base, the story lived. New arrivals heard fragments in their first weeks. A private polishing boots muttered the tale to his bunkmate. A corporal waiting in the chow line told it again, shaping it larger or smaller depending on the audience. The facts blurred, but the core remained. A logistics sergeant had silenced doubt with a single pull of the trigger. On the range, the flags fluttered again with ordinary wind. The desert had lost its stillness, returning to shifting air and mirage shimmer. Adriana Voss was back at her post, bent in the dust, gathering brass casings one by one. The same gloves, the same careful rhythm. To anyone passing, she looked unchanged. A quiet figure stooped in the heat. Yet inside her, the weight was different. She carried the certainty that could not be stripped away, that when the moment came, she had proven herself against the horizon. Kane no longer mocked her. His glance now carried a trace of acknowledgement, though no words followed. Respect had grown in silence, unspoken yet present. Around her, soldiers, who once overlooked her, now watched with a fraction more regard. Even if they did not fully understand why, she did not seek their recognition. She continued her work as she always had, methodical and calm. The whispers grew softer over time, like wind tracing across dunes. Stories moved on, as they always did, replaced by new missions and new names. But some whispers lingered. They carried forward, passed between soldiers on distant postings, recalled in fragments during long nights. Adriana Voss remained in logistics, still unseen in the official record, still walking the range with brass casings in her hands. Yet her legacy endured in quiet echoes, not in headlines or ceremony, but in the memory of those who had witnessed the impossible done by someone no one expected. Some legacies live not in medals, but in whispers across the sand,